There we go. All right.
All right. Okay.
Okay.
I'll get the light.
All right.
Little ways walk through there once in a while, especially kids.
Okay.
Okay. We're
Well,
back.
We're back from a pause. If some of you were here yesterday or the day before or the day before that, we were here all those days too. But now we're back to Greece. So just to do a rundown of what's been going on. All right. So we kind of talked about the epics of Homer, the Mycenaeans, the Minoans. Now we're going to go through and kind of talk about the Greek Middle Ages, or as it's termed by historians, the Greek kind of Dark Ages.
You flip-flop that, but yeah.
Okay, well, yeah, okay, sorry. But point being,
Historians try not to call anything the Dark Ages.
well, that's true. But basically talking about how you have the collapse of Mycenaean culture. You have a new group of people migrating into northern Greece, mainland Greece, and displacing the Mycenaean population. So I'm gonna let Chrissy hop in with this one.
Okay.
All right. Well, you wanted this. No, you wanted to do this one.
So we have this thing where around, if Troy falls around 1250, which is roughly where we think it is. And then you have these invasions. We have the Sea Peoples, some other stuff. Again, if you're in the Tuesday afternoon class, you've heard about some of this too. So around 1100 BCE, we have this group called the Dorians that starts moving south into the Greek peninsula, okay? And they use iron. So we know that this is a different group. This is not just like the Mycenaeans, shifting their use of materials. This is a group that uses iron coming into the area, okay? This pushes a lot of the Mycenaean culture south. And what that ends up becoming is basically Spartan culture. So we see a lot of what the Mycenaeans had been in the culture of the Peloponnesus.
So just kind of give you an idea on the map. Okay, the Peloponnese is this peninsula that juts out. Okay, this is pretty much dominated by Sparta and its allied city-states. When it comes to, okay, and where the Dorians are coming, they're taking over this kind of northern part.
Yeah. So they are basically the ancestors of the Athenians and the other ones in that northern part. So even though we have this differentiation that happens between all of them, the city-states as a whole, or the city-states start developing this shared cultural history. They all kind of embrace the stories that will become the Homeric works, okay? And each of them claim it as part of their heritage. So even though you have the Dorians that have come in after the fact, and you have these Mycenaeans that have been pushed down into Sparta, they have all decided that they share this common thing, okay? And this is also where we get the idea of, I'm not going to say it's where the idea of us and them was invented, because I think humans have always thought that way, even when we were in caves. But it is where we get it kind of codified, okay? And that is in the Iliad. And I'm going to read a quote from Susan Wise Bauer's history here. Quote, in the Iliad, for the first time, we come across the word for those who live outside the triple circle of Greeks. Homer calls them the barbarophoni, the strange speakers. It was a simple division of all people into two, those who spoke a dialect of Greek and those who did not. It was also the seed of an idea which would continue to twine itself more and more tightly around the minds of Greeks. Human nature was binary. It was either Greek or non-Greek, and a man's identity as Greek was at the core of his character. This is where the word barbarian comes from. Okay. So barbarians originally as a concept were people who didn't speak Greek. I think is an interesting little tidbit there. So we don't know a lot about this period because there isn't a lot of writing. What we know about the period comes from after. And one of the things that shows up after pretty quickly is the polis, okay, which is the characteristic political unit of all of the Greek city-states. Okay. In fact, polis means city-state. Okay. And even without the written history, By the time we get written history again, they're pretty much all organized this way. You have a few kingdoms in there, okay, but it still functions basically the same way. And a polis is essentially the city and its surrounding land, the land that, literal sense feeds the city,
So it
okay?
could be the villages, okay, that are around the city on the outskirts of it. And in a lot of cases, because of the way Greece's topography, the terrain is really mountainous. Not a lot of really large tracts of arable land where you can have, a lot of, crops being grown. You have a lot of competition between these city states for resources. So if there's an area where there's really good farmland, it's not unusual for the city states that are near each other to fight brief wars over who controls that particular area. Uh, it's not unusual too for these polys to basically put together alliance systems where they're looking at each other as, okay, we share common enemies, we share common, trade routes, so we work together.
So at the center of the polis is going to be an area that's called the agora. And this is essentially where the business of the city-state was done, both in a sense of the political business, like this is where you would have your meetings of the people who were in charge of the city-state, and also where the commercial business was done. So you would have, stalls with people selling stuff. Okay, it's akin to what we think of the Roman Forum being, and actually the Roman Forum really is just that stolen. If you're more familiar with, forum is a little more familiar of a word to people.
And that idea of having political business and economic business intertwined in the same region, in the same area of a city, that's very old. That comes from the East as well. A lot of times in ancient Mesopotamia, you would have the temple district for that city. That's also where business and politics took place because you only had a certain number of people who knew how to read and write. And if those are your record keepers, those are scribes. Those are specially trained members of the priesthood who are ensuring that the state functions the way that it should.
Fernand Braudel, in his Memory in the Mediterranean, describes a polis like this. Quote, "While linked to an urban center, it was not identical to it. The citizens were residents of a territory greater than the city itself, which was only one element in the state, though an important one, of course. Since everyone made use of its marketplace or agora, its citadel is a place of refuge, and its temple devoted to the divine protector of the polis." So that part about the citadel, also very important, and that's going to come into play a few times as we talk about the Persian Wars and the Peloponnesian Wars. When there was a threat, they would pull everybody from the surrounding countryside into the city. Okay. Which has its advantages and it also has a lot of disadvantages too, which we'll talk about.
Okay, so again, because of the way, you have the topography of Greece, it's the region you live in affects how your culture develops. And when it comes to ancient Greece, especially if it's the mainland, their army is mostly based by infantry. Okay, they don't have a lot of cavalry because there's not a lot of huge open plains to have herds of horses. So for the most part, with this period in Greece, and even with the Mycenaeans before it, it's made up of what would be heavy infantry. So these are citizens of a city. Okay, they have property because they have to buy their own gear, their own panoply, their own armor, their shield, their spear, their sword. In a lot of cases, it's passed down from father to son. Okay. Generally, it's the name for the soldiers. These spearmen are called hoplites, and it's based off of the word is based off of the hoplon, which is the shield. It's a hard wooden shield, usually with a leather wrap that's in front of it. In this case, this is the Spartans. That's the letter, the Greek letter that corresponds to Sparta. Lambda. And so, not every hoplite even is going to be this well equipped. Okay, because you're seeing kind of the difference between the city states. In this case, this is an Athenian hoplite. This is a Spartan hoplite. What they basically do is this is the core of the Greek city-states armies. These are the full citizens, basically property owners, who have the money to basically equip themselves for this type of formation. This is what's called the phalanx. Kind of talked about that last week, where these spearmen are lining up shoulder to shoulder. And you're overlapping. Your top one is on your left side, regardless of whether you're right or left-handed. And you're overlapping your shield with the person who's next to you. And the idea is that you basically form this shield wall, and then you're advancing towards another phalanx, and you have your spear over the top. You're holding it most of the time overhand, or sometimes you hold it underhand because you're trying to get around the shield. If nothing else, in terms of armor, you're going to have a helmet, and you're going to have the shield, because those are the essential things. A lot of times when it comes to the chest and waist, it's just linens that have been basically, melded together using, basically animal fat and glue tendons in order to make a really hard linen, so that it will deflect or at least lessen the impact.
And leather.
Okay,
too.
yeah, and leather of a spear. If you really have a lot of money, you might have either a bronze or an iron breastplate. You're going to want to have these metal greaves, which are protecting your leg from your knee, basically down to your shin. Because again, the spear is going to be, aiming for areas that are vulnerable. The hoplon doesn't cover your whole body. It basically covers from your neck to just below your groin. Okay. The spear itself that they're going to use has two heads. The primary one, which is a longer, kind of spear blade that's about that long. Okay, it's generally designed to kind of look like a leaf, so that when it hits and you actually are able to penetrate the wound won't close right away. You also have on the bottom, okay, at the butt of the spear, you have another spike, and that's for, a couple different things, but what you generally use that for is as you're advancing and you're going over the injured from the other side, you're using that to stab down and kill them with that. Most of hoplite battles, it's kind of these lines of phalanxes that are pushing into each other, waiting for one side or the other to finally get worn out and then break. And so what will end up happening is more casualties happen as the battle degenerates. Because once the phalanx breaks and you don't have the protection of your neighbors on either side of you, and you're trying to leave, that's when you're going to get stabbed easily. There's accounts from a lot of Greek philosophers, basically talking about how
Xenophon's a big one.
yeah, Xenophon's a big one. Herodotus,
Yeah.
talking about how when the phalanx breaks, a lot of times they will walk backwards because it's better to die with the wounds facing the enemy than behind, because it shows that you're not afraid of it. That doesn't mean that, the hoplites are the only troops that are on the battlefield, because again, that would be really horrific and expensive for the city-state to lose their political and military leaders. So you have people who don't have the money to basically get the Penelope for hoplite, who are archers or who are slingers, depending on where you're at in Greece too. If there are areas where, there's enough pasture land for horses, you might have a little bit of cavalry, but they're very rare, at least in classical Greece.
And note too that nobody had uniforms except for the Spartans.
Yeah.
Okay, these things were not uniform. The Spartans, all of them had the same equipment, or the same basic equipment,
Yeah.
and then variations depending on a soldier's position, and all of their shields looked the same. All of them had the lambda on it for Laconia. Okay,
which is their name for the Peloponnese.
right. They didn't. They if you've seen the 300, there's that like, we are Sparta moment, and they would have never said that. They would have said, we are Laconians. And if you haven't seen 300, don't bother.
Yeah.
Yeah, so they have a uniform. Everybody else is working from what they can collect, what they inherit. And one of the really interesting things about these other city-states is that they decorated their shields. Okay, you can see this guy has the kind of, it's kind of a funny, scary face, They would put stuff on the shields that were intended to be distracting. Okay, so you would have scary faces, you would have maybe slightly funny things on it. The idea being that you're pulling like,
Attention away from.
yeah, you're pulling attention away. You also might invoke particular gods, Ares being the god of war, in the images that you put on your shield, and that way pulling in the power of the god or the favor of the god as well.
Yeah. And with the city-states, the Greek city-states, there are no professional armies except for kind of Sparta. For the most part, the men who are the hoplites and even the rest of the Greek soldiers, they're regular citizens. So they are not always under arms. A lot of times they're farmers or they're merchants or they're craftsmen. They fight for a particular season. Usually it's after crops have been planted and they fight through the summer and then combat stops in the fall so that you can harvest. And then you don't fight in the winter because it's too rough for it. Sparta is different, and we'll kind of get into that because while they are a very powerful army, there's not a lot of them, but they've enslaved all of the people who are around them to basically do all the work for them so that they can be warriors.
Yes. What was the other thing I was going to say? I forgot. Okay. Went right out of my head.
That's okay. And over the course of, pretty much all of classical, Greek history and even into the age of Alexander and beyond, the Greeks don't just stay in the Greek homeland, they colonize. They spread across the Western Mediterranean, the Eastern Mediterranean, they go along the coastline of the Black Sea. And the idea is that, the city-states that are at home, eventually they hit a point where, it's a peak population where there's enough people that can go out into the wider Mediterranean world or beyond in order to set up new city-states. And it's interesting because it's not like what you would think of colonization in the Age of Discovery, where these new colonies that have been set up are loyal or sending material back to their home, their mother city state. Instead, they are their own, for the most part, independent entity. But if there is some sort of large existential danger, they'll ask their mother city for aid. But for the most part, once a new city state is established, whether it's in Italy or Sicily, southern France, or the coastline of the Black Sea, for all intents and purposes, that is an entirely new political entity. And this, the colonization of the Greeks is one of the things that drives so much of what we see as Western culture, because they establish themselves in so many different areas. And it doesn't matter where you're at. Most of the new city-states are going to be damn near copies of the old ones, and they're interconnected. So if there's plays that are being written in Corinth or Athens, they're going to show up in these colonies not that far down the road. And in many cases, especially along, the area that's, Asia Minor, those city-states are going to become very wealthy, and they will be centers of the Greek world, in some cases surpassing the mother cities.
That's why the Greeks didn't refer to it as, these are our Greek colonies. They would talk about a specific, like, oh, we're going to talk about Syracuse or something like that. So the Romans are the ones who actually named the larger concept, which is Magna Graecia, Greater Greece. The Greeks sort of looked at that and said, yeah, no, those are all just their own states. Just before we finish this one, a little bit about how it was put together, and this is also from Fernand Braudel. He says, barring a few exceptions, each new foundation was the result of a deliberate voyage, generally undertaken on the advice of a Delphic oracle. The expedition was led by a founder, the Oikiestes, acting on the orders of the home city. With the protection of the gods, he chose the site, supervised the work of the surveyors and the distribution of the land, and adopted the constitution of the homeland to fit the new city.
In a lot of the areas where these new cities are coming in, it's much more, the lands are not as mountainous, they're not as rough. So these cities are able to grow a lot of crops. They're able to get natural resources that are not available in Greece. And again, that's one of the reasons why, especially in the region that's going to be, modern day Turkey, those become incredibly important because they're massive cities. They have a lot of wealth. They have a lot of influence. When it comes to the northern Black Sea, the kind of crazy part about that is those kind of become breadbaskets, okay, for mainland Greece, because, you're looking at the area, it's Ukraine today. Okay, so really rich, fertile, what would be considered black soil. Uh, that's not saying that the native inhabitants of those regions particularly care for the Greeks. There's a lot of conflict when the Greeks come in because again, it's that idea of us versus them. You're out, we're outsiders, but and we're coming into this region, but we're claiming it as our own. And
Similar to the way the Europeans treated this continent.
yeah. And so they'll interact with the natives. If it's peaceful, it works well, but a lot of times there's warfare.
So on the far eastern side of the Mediterranean. They did not colonize that because there was already people there. So Syria and Egypt area.
There are going to be settlements that are in those regions, but nothing near what is going to be in Turkey. In this area, at this point in time, as this, wave of colonization is taking place, you still have Egypt as a regional power.
Pretty strong.
Get
Yeah.
pretty strong. You're going to have, okay, starting, the introduction of the Hebrew kingdoms, of the kingdom of Judah and Israelite, or of Israel. You're going to have, okay, Babylonians and Persians who are taking over this whole area. And while because of the way the Greeks kind of interact with their neighbors, kind of almost, I won't say xenophobic. It's not that they're afraid of their neighbors, and it's not that they're not very welcoming of outside groups as they come in. Again, it's that idea that, there's these areas that are dominated by the Greeks and everyone else, even if they're older, because they don't share that Greek culture in some way, shape, or form, they're inferior. Okay, with the Greeks, again, the way that they fight war, that hoplite warfare, it's the idea of it's melded into their culture, the idea of warrior versus warrior, face to face. They look at people who use ranged weapons, slings, javelins, archers. They see them as cowardly because you're killing an enemy from a distance. And for the most part, most of the rest of, the Eastern Mediterranean, they don't use heavy armor like the Greeks do. It's mostly linen, that they have. And they're used to fighting different tactics, again, because of how open a lot of this area is. You'll have infantry in the army, but a decisive wing for these guys, it's cavalry. And so it kind of, it's that idea that, for the Greeks, they're looking at it as if you're not going to fight face to face, then you're not actually a real warrior.
The thing to remember too is that the eastern part is where the other major powers are.
Yeah.
Okay. The western part is all barbarians, as they would say.
Yeah.
Rome has not reared its head yet. So the idea of we're going to go west because that's going to be easier to conquer.
Disorganized.
Yeah. It's tribal peoples instead of, say, all of Persia coming down on your head. But also, as important as the Eastern Mediterranean is, it's also not the easiest place to live, for the most part. So if you can take, what is modern day Ukraine and have lovely wheat crops, why bother living in the desert?
Was it the Scythians that they were fighting in the Black Sea area?
Yes. Yeah, Scythians were a very notable and incredible nomadic society where they basically think of them as really ancient versions of Mongols. The idea that they're a horse culture. They move seasonally depending on what's there. And the Scythians, the Greeks, in one sense, hated them, but they liked hiring them as mercenaries because they made up for the fact that the Greeks didn't have horse. They didn't have cavalry.
The few settlements they had, the men were always out fighting. Is that where the myth of the
Amazons, yeah.
Yeah, because
Kind of, sort of, yeah. And with the Scythians, there's a lot more to their culture than what we have been able to find. Yeah, we know that they had really elaborate metalworking, really elaborate linens. They could make really beautiful and functional, trade goods, luxury goods, and weapons. And so, the way that the Greeks portray them is that, the Scythians are just these kind of wild barbarians that move back and forth. And that shaped the way that, Europe really, Western Europe views them. But as you have Ukrainian and Russian archaeological teams looking at the steppe in Russia and Ukraine, they're finding some really elaborate burials. And the fact that there may have been large-scale Scythian cities that were semi-permanent. But the Greeks never penetrated that deeply into the region. So, again, the Greeks are looking at it, there's the Greek world and then there's the barbarian world. We only interact with the barbarians as much as we need to.
You've prompted a thought here. It's, even though it's a Latin Roman word that we use, civilization, coming from the word for the city in Latin, civitas, okay? It's the Greeks that really come up with the idea of you're civilized if you live in a city, and if you're nomadic, you're not. And that is something that we see come down, throughout the entirety of human history after that, particularly in the West.
Yeah.
If you think about the way the tribal peoples of the Americas were looked at. These are inherently uncivilized because they did not have cities, so they were inherently less than, perceived as inherently less than.
Yeah.
So that's, you made me think of that just then.
And even, closer to the Greek homeland, okay, if you're not in, the Greek peninsula, kind of modern day or classical Greece at the time, if you're in Macedonia, which is in the north, or you're in Thessaly, which is right next to it, to the north, if you're Thracian, your Greek cousins, only half barbarian.
Yeah.
They're in the family, but they're like the hillbilly versions of them.
The Macedonians were particularly like that, yeah.
Yeah, because they speak a dialect of Greek, they share the same gods, the same festivals, the same culture, but because they are not fully city-state, Macedonia is a kingdom. It's a rustic kingdom, but it's a kingdom under one king ruling the whole area. Again, they're allowed to be in the Greek world, but they're not allowed to actually participate in the Olympics. They're not allowed to go to many of the major festivals that are in the mainland. They're tolerated. And the thing is, the Macedonians, the Thessalians, and Thracians, they're useful to the Greeks because they shield them from other barbarians. Because the barbarians further north have to go through their territory.
The Illyrians,
Mhm.
and and basically they were Greek.
Yeah, to a degree, Greek, they're
cousins too.
very, very, the Greeks are, again, the ones who are in the peninsula, they are very particular on who they view as pure Greek versus who is a cousin to it. Again, it's that idea of depending on where you live, if you don't have those large city-states or you speak a kind of different dialect of Greek, that counts against you in the classic world.
Go to the next one.
Okay. Is it ready to roll?
If you're sharing the second screen, it should just pick it right up. Yeah, so just leave that as is.
Okay. Okay, so now that we've talked about kind of how, at least mainland Greece is developing after, the collapse of the Mycenaeans, now we're going to talk about how the city-states, even though, they're all Greek on the mainland, they operate differently from each other, depending on what their government system is, again, where the location of the city is at, and what their ultimate kind of goal is going to be. And then we're going to talk about how the Greeks interact with older civilizations.
Yeah. So you can see this is usually intended to be a lecture a week later, because this slide is supposed to remind you of what a polis is, but we just talked about that, so that's okay. It is the central piece of the city-state.
Yeah.
And the surrounding land. So they have a lot of different types of system of government. We tend to think of Greece as democratic, small d democratic, because of Athens, all right? But Athens was odd in that. Okay, and Athens was, it was a democracy. It was as close to a democracy as you are going to get in that place, time, and circumstance, but it was still incredibly limited. But there were all sorts of other types of government, and there's 5 of them that are identified by the Greek scholars particularly. Okay, so democracy would be rule by all, okay, or rule by all of your voting citizenry, which for Athens meant property owning adult men. Okay. So that's why it's a limited democracy. Then you have oligarchy. Oligarchy is ruled by a few. Okay. However, those few get into that position. That's just ruled by a few.
Sounds familiar.
Yeah, no comment there. Aristocracy is ruled by a few who are related to each other. Okay, so, and there's possibly a monarch included in that. So the difference between those two is basically bloodlines, right? And then you have a timocracy or a plutocracy, which is ruled by the wealthy, okay, primarily landowners. Oh, here, I forgot those are on there. And then tyranny is ruled by a tyrant, by one person. Now, keep in mind here that tyranny to the ancient Greeks did not necessarily mean, was not necessarily a negative. It was just ruled by an individual. Okay, often it was negative. That's how we end up with the negative connotation today. But it could be a circumstance where they want to be ruled by an individual in a time of emergency. The Romans did this too. They called it a dictator. You have an incident, a war, something that requires a singular line of, for lack of a better term, orders coming down to deal with things. And then that would be a tyranny. That person is a tyrant, not always bad. And not always permanent by any means.
Yeah, and with these polys, it's also not that, they permanently remain one type of government. In a lot of cases, they switch
Mhm.
depending on what the circumstances are.
And
If they
mix
lose,
together.
yeah, and mix together, or if they lose a war, and the ruling government that they had is going to be replaced by the winning power, by finding citizens of the defeated city who will basically be the puppets.
I will say though, in the words of Ronald Syme in his book, The Roman Revolution, in all ages, whatever the form and name of government, be it monarchy, republic, or democracy, an oligarchy lurks behind the facade. All governments in the end tend to be oligarchies.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And even the term of democracy, when it comes to Athens, that evolves over time.
Yeah.
Many times, because the definition of what a citizen is in Athens changes. In some cases because of social pressure inside the city state, or because the state is going bankrupt and they have to have more citizens in order to pay more taxes.
You can be a citizen, you have to pay taxes, yes,
Now,
yes.
most of this is pre-Rome.
Yes.
We're talking large amounts of slaves.
Yes, but keep in mind that the slaves in the ancient world are going to come primarily from prisoners of war and criminals. Okay, and it's really more prisoners of war. Some debtors, sometimes too.
Yeah. And slavery is not a generational.
It's not permanent
issue.
except in Sparta.
Yeah. So basically, if you're a slave in one of these, if you're a prisoner of war, or you're a criminal, or you're a debtor, your status as a slave does not pass to your spouse, and it does not pass to your children. So you can have free children, you can have a free wife or free husband. Well,
Men could have free children.
yeah, that's true. But yeah,
Any women who produce children while they are enslaved, those children are enslaved too.
but it's
Generally.
yeah, and it's generally not racially based. Not like in what will be the new world, starting with the
This,
conquest of the Americas.
this carries over to Rome though, because a lot of
Mm.
Roman slaves become the administrators.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's 2 different ways slavery can function in a society. There is the society with slaves, and there is a slave society. Okay, so a society that functions, that has slaves but could function without them. If you could replace all the slaves with wage workers and it wouldn't be too disruptive. it would be disruptive, but it wouldn't be too disruptive comparatively speaking. That's a society with slaves. Okay. A slave society is one where the economy, the society is based upon the use of slaves. And to disrupt that would completely destroy the society. So of course, the very easy example of that is the American South. Okay, that was a slave society that required complete destruction to stop being a slave society. Most of the Greek city-states, again, Sparta being the exception, are societies with slaves. Okay. They are not as reliant on slaves as we tend to think they are, or as we're taught when we're, younger. They're certainly not as reliant on slaves as the American South was. I always come back to that because that's the core of what we understand slavery to be in the United States. Part of that is because you have a lot of people doing work that is equivalent of slaves. And when I say that, I mean women. Because there is that level of it. Sparta, we'll get to Sparta and talk about that. So, but slaves were incredibly important to the point where you have, it's either Socrates or Aristotle or both. Actually, I think it's all three of them: Socrates, Plato, and
Pluto.
oh yeah.
It's about a week. Basically saying that
They're required.
Yeah, they're required because you can't have you can't have philosophers full time if they have to work.
Yeah, in order to have the great things of society, of culture, of Greekness, you have to have somebody who does the laundry.
Yeah,
I mean, every society has essentially what is a slave class, even if they don't call it that. And I include modern United States in that, and modern world in that. It's just a different way of doing it. So, yeah.
I think these slaves were escaping because they look like the other people.
Good question.
Blacks.
And that was, you have hit on one of the reasons that slavery became racialized in the New World. Literally, they thought to themselves, yeah, we'll be able to tell who they are. Branding sometimes. Tattooing. But the thing is that if it's a status you can eventually purchase your way out of, and then become, if not a full citizen, at least, in between, you're freed. There isn't the need to have that differentiation.
Yeah.
Okay. Who your slaves are. Yeah, they run away. Absolutely, they ran away. There was also less concern about, I don't want to say less concern about them running, about uprisings and stuff, because there was that, but it wasn't the same.
It wasn't quite so systematic where everything relied on them. And so again, it's kind of one of those instances, government, slavery, economies, those concepts evolve over time, depending on what you need. Again, that idea of slavery, unless you're a criminal or a prisoner of war, and even with a criminal, depending on what the crime was, there's a certain amount of time that you're going to be basically enslaved.
Mm-hmm.
And then once that expires, you're kind of free to go. Or, this applies more to the Romans later on, but if you're in debt, you can buy and sell yourself into slavery, depending on what your economic situation is.
With the Romans, slavery was there were two types of slavery in Rome. There was the plantation style slavery. The Romans actually did do not the chattel part of it, the chattel part of it, but not the inherited part of it, in the way that was done in the Americas, where you would just work people to death on plantations. Okay. But on the other side of that, Roman society was so accepting of slaves and former slaves that it was perfectly reasonable and sometimes desirable to be a Roman slave, to be a slave of the Romans versus a free person somewhere else. There were many, many, many Greeks who sold themselves into slavery to Romans so that they could go be teachers of the children of the aristocracy,
handling the accounting.
Yeah, handling the accounting, or being a secretary, Julius Caesar's secretary was not Greek, but in that level of power, this is a person who is enslaved, okay, who has no actual legal power of their own,
But because they're
but
who,
they have power.
yeah, because who owns them?
Mhm.
And in many cases, in Roman society, you could be a slave. You gain your free status, and then your former master is basically your patron,
Yeah.
who helps you get into society to build your own.
And the Greeks weren't like that.
No.
The Greeks were, you're enslaved or you're not. Soon, we're not gonna help you. But yeah, slavery was definitely an issue.
Yeah.
We have more written about Roman slavery than
Yeah.
Greek slavery in that way. Except for Sparta. We'll get to that.
Okay, so just to go back to the hoplites, and I'm gonna go through and explain the whole thing again, but this is, the reenactors basically going through it, and what you're.
So
This
those
is
awesome
this is a
shields.
really, this is a really sad version of phalanx warfare right here. Hoplite warfare, because you're not generally just gonna have one row of guys fighting three rows. They're gonna try to have the same number of rows so they have the same traction power against each other. Again, you're pushing your shield into the enemy, and then the lines of men who are behind you are pushing you with their shield. So you're being compressed if you're at the front, you're being pushed into the enemy line, and you're hoping to unbalance the other side so that they either break or they fall. And you're also kind of stabbing over the top of the shield in order to try to hit, their eyes or their neck, especially the neck but you can see how, with that spear, it's not exactly as long, they're not as long as they should be. The blade, okay, with it, but they're leaf shaped. Again, it's to make the wound bigger so that it bleeds and makes the person fall out of line quicker. Generally, too, depending on where you're at, like Athens was a sea power. It had a huge navy in order to trade and to protect its colonies. But it also had hoplites. When it comes to Sparta, because they're inland, they don't need a navy. They rely on other city-states that are allied to them for that. Pretty much all of the cities that the Greeks build, whether it's in the homeland or it's in these colonies, they're going to have very extensive fortifications to defend the city. Okay, so you're going to have walls and towers that surround the circumference or the outside of the city-state. Generally, your city-state too. Chrissy was talking about the citadel. The citadel is kind of in the heart of the city. Generally, you want a city location for your city that has a hill in there. And you make that where you have your main temples, especially for the patron god or goddess, but you also wall that off too. And that is the area of last resort. If the city walls collapse, the citadel becomes the last fortress for the citizens. So you have cisterns for water, you're gonna have supplies of wine and food that are gonna be up there, and you're basically. Yeah, yeah. Well, in a lot of cases, wine is safer to drink than water. Because where you're going to the bathroom is generally the river that you're getting your water from. Okay, as you go through this, disease is a huge part of classical Greece, where a lot of these sieges either break because the defenders are able to survive because the attacking army is hit by dysentery or some other thing, or you have plagues break out in the cities that are being besieged, where they lose a quarter of their population because the people are so packed on top of each other.
Some of the earliest examples of we might term biological warfare come out of these sieges, because you'd have some kind of plague break out in the city, and they would just toss the bodies over the wall, hoping it would infect the enemy.
Or going in the other direction. You're throwing the bodies in different spots. One of the only cities that we know that does not have city walls is Sparta. And that's because it's conquered literally all of the countryside, well beyond its own borders.
And they complain later. There's an incident between Sparta and Athens later, because Sparta decides that they want walls and Athens won't help.
Yeah. But the idea is with, again, Spartan society, that city-state, every male citizen that is there is a warrior before they're anything else. All of the people in the surrounding countryside are the slaves that make sure. Sparta is that exception. Sparta is a slave society. Once they lose control of the countryside, Sparta is not important anymore. It's still there. It still complains, but it doesn't have the ability to actually fight like it had in the past.
So, again, mentioned this earlier, the police all identify with Homer's epics. It is that which is Greek and that which is not Greek, okay? There were particular rules about who was a citizen, and that status was very carefully protected, again, except Sparta. It's fun, the exception that proves the rule, okay? Citizenship is an issue for men. Okay, women who are the daughters of Athenian citizens are just automatically assumed to be citizens. They cannot do anything with that status other than pass it on to their male children. So the issue of whether or not a woman is a citizen was only relevant to the relationship of her with her sons, okay, and the daughters who are then going to do the same thing. Women were in basically the same place societally in all the polis. Something that you will have heard me said, and I'll say it again. The purpose of women in the ancient world is to produce sons. That's it. That's what they're there for. Everything else they do can be done by slaves or servants. Okay. Particularly when you're looking at somewhere like Athens, women are there to produce legitimate children, and that's it.
And pretty much kept out of society.
Yeah. So you have two extremes in the Greek polis of this era. You have Athens, which essentially kept the women locked in the back rooms, okay, in figuratively and literally, okay, depending on. And then you have the other side of that, which is Sparta, where the women had complete freedom of the polis, in some ways had a few more freedoms than men because they didn't have to go to war. And all the other Greek city-states thought they were crazy. So there's wide shift on that, yes. So let's talk about Sparta. Sparta is on the Peloponnesus, okay? That's the hand part of the hand of Greece, all right? Here. Yeah. Their region was called Laconia, as I mentioned earlier, and it's signified by the capital Lambda, which is a thing that looks like an A without the cross between it, on their shields. Should we talk about the enslavement?
Sure. Okay, so Spartan society, the city-state, it is a warrior culture. Again, anyone who is a male citizen of Sparta is basically from the time they're about 7 or 8, taken away from their families and then put into these communal barracks where they are taught how to fight, how to forage, how to read, how to write. Basically, the idea is that these Spartan men, these boys, are going to be soldiers for the vast majority of their entire life. They are with their, I guess you could call them their cohort, their classmates, pretty much from the time that they're all grabbed until they finally hit a point when they're in their 30s that they're allowed to have their own separate homes. But they're still expected to go back to these barracks to have their meals and to do their training.
And all of this, the purpose of all of this is to maintain martial law over the helots. Okay.
The helots are
the
slaves in the countryside.
Okay.
All of the villages, all the other cities that are around there that the Spartans have conquered, those are the people that grow the crops, that will be the artisans. They're doing everything to keep the city of Sparta functioning.
And the fear of a slave revolt is what creates in the Spartans the need to have a standing army. Okay, so you said they are a standing army because they need to maintain control over the helots, and because of the helots, they have created the standing army. It's this vicious circle.
Yeah.
The helots are all owned by the state. Okay, the individual Spartans are going to have slaves who are with them. Okay, who live in their home and work in their home, but they aren't movable property in the way that Americans think of slavery, in that they could be bought and sold. Okay, they are owned by the state. They are essentially a group of people who are under constant martial law and can legally be killed or anything else done to them by any Spartan citizen for any reason.
And it's actually
they have no rights.
It's expected of these Spartan boys as they start to come to age that they kill a helot. Mm-hmm. That's part of their initiation. That's part of their blood. The idea that they're enforcing the state.
So as Jay was saying, they're removed from their homes at the age of 7. Because that's about the time that they're saying women can influence them. Now, keep in mind, daughters basically are staying in the home with their mothers until they marry. And even maybe a little bit past that, we'll get into that. They live in the barracks until they are 30. Once they are 30, they are allowed to go live in their own home, but they still have to take at least 1 meal a day, and it's usually the midday meal in the barracks until they are 60. When they are 60, they are officially retired. They do not have to go to war anymore if they don't want to.
Yeah.
They still do.
Yeah,
Because
and
what else are they gonna do?
Yeah, and the thing is too, to hit 60
Is rare.
is rare.
What's the lifespan back then?
Okay, so the rule on that, you want to figure, because the average was 35-ish, okay? But that is taking into account infant mortality. Okay, so when you're born, you have a 50-50 to get to a year old. From a year to 5 years old, it's another 50-50. From 5 to 10, it's another 50-50. And then from 5 to 15, it's another 50-50. Okay, but if you can get to adulthood, we'll call 15 adulthood for this.
Yeah.
All right, you are just as likely to hit 70 as we are.
Yeah.
The thing is you have to take into account, think about every time in your life you had antibiotics. Think about every time in your life you had to have some kind of surgery. You know, anything that requires modern medicine,
Yeah.
you know.
And
you
the
might
two
not
most
survive.
dangerous things for people
Yeah.
in the ancient world, if it's a woman, childbirth. If it's a man, war.
War.
And surviving those.
Yeah. Yeah.
They were slaves,
Yes.
so some of them could be Greek if they were criminal.
Oh, no, the Helots were their own thing. They were their own thing.
Yeah, they were Greek, but
They started Greek.
Yeah, they started Greek and then,
They were okay, so I told you about how as the Dorians invaded in the north, they pushed the Mycenaeans down. The Helots are people who are called the Messenians, and they were conquered by the Mycenaeans as they came into the Peloponnesus. And that was that. So they were Greek already. They just got conquered.
yeah, and then their
Yeah.
status.
Yeah, what we were talking about with slave status does not apply here.
Yeah,
Yeah.
with Sparta, pretty much,
They
the
are
Helots are.
That's okay.
Oh, no, that's okay.
Let me remind you with other things. All right, so when a Spartan baby is born,
Male or female.
yeah, male or female, they're inspected at birth. Any defects mean exposure. Okay, that's it. If a child is born, with as small a defect as missing a finger, okay, nope, can't have that. That is not a Spartan child. All the way up to, whatever horrible, unimaginable defects you can think of in a child. Now, exposure meant you put the baby outside.
And let the elements.
And let the elements take care of it. 90% of the time, 95% of the time in Sparta, exposed babies who weren't terribly deformed were picked up by the Helots. Okay. That was just something that was I don't know if it's like a cultural thing or like and it wasn't that the Spartans said, okay, this child is defective, therefore they're going to be a slave. Okay. But it was maybe just it's hard to put a motive on it for something like this, but you almost feel as though the Helots felt for these children and were trying to, give them a life at all. But you read repeatedly in the sources about how, children were exposed and then picked up by the Helots. So yeah, but they had to be perfect. Check my notes here. If the defect was not severe, they were picked up by the Helots. Shall we take a break? I just saw the time.
Yeah.
All right, well, we'll pause at babies and we'll come back with children. Come back about 5 after. I don't know if anybody wants to run to Starbucks, so.
Can we talk a bit about the Olympic Games?
I don't have a lot in here about it, but we can.
We can, yeah.
Yeah.
Now, eventually, there was the Hera Games for women, but they didn't do anything they were not allowed at the Olympics even as spectators, because most of the games were in the nude.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
I know that later in Greek society, there was, I believe it's the Hera Games for women.
Yeah, and I honestly don't know much about that beyond the fact that they existed.
So
But
there was at least some, in
Mhm.
some of the Greek city-states, there was some participation by women.
take a break, take a
Yeah,
break.
take a break. Get a pop, get a coffee.
Don't try to get a pop out of the machine at the end of the hall.
Yeah, and-
That machine.
Take your money in.
Mhm.
yeah. Okay, so,
Okay,
okay.
so
All right,
if you are a Spartan child a Spartan baby who has decided that they get to be a Spartan child, they are generally you're raised in your mother's house. The women were literate, okay, generally speaking, and numerate. So they're going to be the ones who teach the, early education type stuff, like in the modern day, and like in most societies like that. Uh, and then at 7, there's the split. The boys go to the barracks and the girls stay home. Now, once the boys go to the barracks, they have a very difficult life. Okay. They are issued one set of clothing per year. Okay. And they are fed, they are fed the worst food. Okay.
in
They're
small amounts.
in small amounts. The most common meal for them was what was it called? It was a blood stew, blood soup. There was a special word for it. Now I
But the idea
Yeah.
behind it was to get
Yeah,
to
let's-
get them used to the idea that when they're on campaign, you don't have a supply column that's going to give you food and water and everything. You have to know how to survive on your own. So one of the other things that was encouraged was that, you go out into the city and you try to steal food. And if you get caught, you get the crap beat out of you by, the merchant, but then you also get the crap beat out of you by the person who is your officer because you got caught.
Yeah.
That's the idea that, they're learning that they are going to have to be for the most part, self-reliant when wars start. And there's a lot of, again, to get these kids ready to fight in the phalanx, there's a lot of physical training that goes into it. They have to learn how to use a spear, how to, form up in the line in order to not break when it comes in. Because again, combat in this is terrifying because those helmets are all enclosing. You have a very limited field of vision. You generally can't hear. So for the most part, what your signals are going to be trumpets or they're going to be drums because those are the only things loud enough for you to hear and understand when you're on the battlefield. And it's not unusual too for, in the Greek city-states, in their armies, for the soldiers who are, going in Spartans and Thebes, a few other ones. They have what are called sacred bands. These are pairs of male lovers who have gone up through the ranks with each other. And the idea is that they fight harder because their lover is in the battle with them. Okay, that's not unusual. And it's
One covers the other with their shield.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
They're
and
right next to each
again, the
other in
idea
line.
of, what we would consider modern homosexuality does not really fit in the ancient world like that, because a lot of these men also had wives and children. But if they're on campaign, the person that they're keeping warm with or relieving stress with is a soldier who's their lover with them. That was not unusual for that to happen.
They had work husbands.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, so then they're allowed to marry once they hit age 20. And they are expected to marry. Most of the Spartan marriages are arranged, okay? The problem is they have to live in the barracks until they're 30.
But they're
So-
expected to start producing children,
Right.
males, as soon as they get married,
Yes.
so.
A woman who doesn't fall pregnant within a year of marriage, not her fault. It is considered that her husband is not brave enough to sneak out of the barracks to come have sex with her. Okay.
And that could be grounds for divorce.
Yeah, and it can be grounds for divorce. Spartan women could divorce. Now, here's the other part of that. I said Spartans were not as concerned about lineage, right? They just want good, strong Spartans who are going to go fight and be good, strong Spartans. So Spartan women could conduct affairs with anybody they wanted. Okay, didn't matter if they were married or single. Okay, if they wanted to, if they found the neighbor particularly good looking and thought that he would produce a good, strong Spartan, then by all means, okay. They had such a small amount of personal movable property for inheritance from father to son that it wasn't worth being worried about lineage. It wasn't worth being worried about inheritance in the way that all of the other cultures of the ancient world, almost all of them were. So you have these stories of Spartan women who they marry and then they go set up housekeeping, or they stay home with in their mother's home, that depends. And then, if their husband doesn't come visit them, but they like their husband enough that they don't necessarily want to divorce him, then they might go find somebody else to get pregnant with. And nobody has a problem with that. On the other side of that, excuse me. I don't know how I was going to finish that sentence actually, so just leave it there.
That's the thing,
Yeah.
Sparta, for as fearsome a reputation as they have in terms of military prowess, there are not a lot of full Spartans floating around. The way that they end up filling out their army is basically getting allied city-states to give them hoplites to fight alongside them. It's not saying that there's only 1,000 of them or something like that, but they're not this, it's not a tens of thousands of soldiers at a time going out there. And in a lot of cases with the city-states, when they do go to war, they're not looking to annihilate the other side, because with that kind of battle is also going to really hurt you too and make you vulnerable to other city-states or other threats. So warfare, while it could be devastating, it is limited in many instances.
Before
What's the main reason for the wars at that time?
Generally over resources.
Okay.
Yeah.
Where, if you have, the Sparta is the one that basically controls the Peloponnese, that little part of the peninsula they're on. Athens is its biggest rival. There's other city-states like Corinth and Thebes that are closer to Athens. They all compete for trade. They compete for, arable land. If your allies, your smaller city-states that are allied to you, switch sides, go to the opposing team, so to speak, that's when you go to war, because you want to make sure that your alliance system doesn't collapse. So.
Just before I forget, the boys having to sneak out to get food, to get clothing, to get anything they want beyond the very little that they're given, also trains them to sneak out once they get married. So that goes in there. But Spartans were very well known around the ancient world as good spies, because they were able to sneak around and quietly take care of themselves and all of that. About 50% of the boys that went into the barracks at the age of 7 did not make it to adulthood. Either because they were, normal childhood diseases, infections and things like that. But then on top of that, the education of warfare and the lack of food, But it was a eugenics program.
Yeah.
Just to be blunt about it, it was a eugenics program in a time when the only way you could do that was natural selection or almost natural selection. But they thought themselves very important, and they reassured themselves that all of this was to make sure that the Spartans were the best.
And a lot of the other Greek city-states rightfully feared them.
Yeah.
Because the Spartans were professional soldiers compared to everybody else.
They were also incredibly superstitious, which caused problems with other city-states, as we'll get into as we get into the Persian Wars, which is going to end up being partially next week too. So Spartan women are uniquely free amongst the Greek world and really in the ancient world in general. Okay. In Athens, the women got the worst food. They weren't supposed to go out in public. They weren't supposed to be educated. They basically, they're baby machines, right? In Sparta, because they are conducting a eugenics program, they figured out that healthy, well-fed women are going to produce healthier, stronger babies. Yeah.
That's a duh.
Yeah, no, I mean, it seems obvious. Oh, that was the other thing too. Excuse me. Spartan women didn't generally marry until they were 17 or 18. Okay, so they waited to start having babies.
Which again
also
gets a
meant they're
better
healthier.
survival rate during birth.
Yeah. So to that end, okay, all of the Greek city-states had an area what they would call the gymnasia, and that's where you exercised, and some businesses usually conducted there. It's where you did your training, all of that. In every city-state except Sparta, that was a closed male area, okay? In Sparta, the men exercised at the gymnasia in the morning, women exercised in the afternoon, gesundheit. Okay. All exercise was done in the nude. Okay, women and men. They weren't exercise, they weren't at the same time. But this is something that you read. Xenophon in particular writes about how the Spartans are absolutely crazy because they let their women run around naked. And the way you read it, if you don't know that this is what he means, it sounds like they're just walking around naked all the time. Which I think he was trying to convey. They are supposed to be strong. They're educated, okay, as much as anybody was educated. You don't get a lot of philosophers out of Sparta, but most of them were literate and numerate.
And the idea is, since the men are going to war, the women stay behind to run the state.
Yeah. So the women are the ones who can, I mean, everybody can inherit and bequeath property, but they tended to have very little in the way of property. Okay. The other thing about holding the helots under martial law and having this idea of being this unified state is that property was held mostly in common. Okay. Nobody had their own fields, okay, to grow grain. Nobody had, you had what was your personal property. Okay. So you might have, you have your house that you live in, but you know, it's not necessarily going to be given off to your kids later. It might be pulled back and given to somebody else. It's almost communistic, but not quite. You might have like a kitchen garden where you're growing stuff, but you're not going to have a situation where any one Spartan has more food than anybody else. Well, the women have more food than the men, but you get what I mean. Nobody's starving in Sparta as long as there is food to be had. Okay. Nobody is unhoused in Sparta who are Spartans as long as there's housing to be had. They had money. Famously, their money was massive bricks that you couldn't carry. Okay. So, because they didn't care about those types of things. It was everything was geared toward, we are warriors. We have this warrior state. We are going to maintain this warrior state, and that's it. And that's one of the reasons the slaves were not held as personal property, that they were held by the state too. So, but there was some, you know, you do see some property moving back and forth, but it's small stuff. Yeah.
And again, it's very restrictive as to who Spartan citizens are. It's not, they do not go through the process like Athens of expanding citizenship inside the city. You're basically in these citizen families, and that's it. You do not rotate much beyond that.
Having said that, it followed both the female and the male line. A woman who presents a healthy baby Spartan boy because she is Spartan, no one's asking. As I said earlier, no one's worried about who the father is. The father could be the helot next door. Okay, but as long as this is a good, strong Spartan boy, that's fine. So in practice, on paper, they're very restrictive. In practice, genetically, they're not. Yeah.
And Spartan government is interesting because you have two kings ruling equally at the same time. The idea is that when war is declared, one stays in Sparta, one will lead the army. It's split up too, that you have this elected council of elders. These are the old Spartans, males who have survived
These are
the
you
combat.
have to be over 60 to start with before you can be elected to the council of elders, and they're called the Gerousia.
Yeah. So these are the most experienced men in the city. For the most part, you know, these are the veterans of different wars. They've been officers, they've been generals at times. So they're going to be the ones who advise the kings as to what to do, you know, in time of war or in time of crisis. And then you have the General Assembly, which is all of the other male citizens.
The ones over the age of between 30 and 60.
Yeah. So the ones who have left the barracks. Again, it's kind of that idea that the longer you survived in Spartan society as a male citizen, the more experience and the more you actually have
Physical power.
Yeah.
physical power in the game. Because again, if you're an old warrior, you survived a lot to get to this area. So you're going to know what's going to end up going on.
So the kings were the priests of the state religion, which was basically just worshiping war. Yeah, they were a lot. They did sacrifices to the gods, just like the other Greek city-states did. They, as I said, were very superstitious, but a lot of their superstition revolved around excuses for not leaving home because they were afraid of slave uprisings. We'll get to that. They have the final say in legal matters, so they are the ultimate court to go to. And as Jay said, they serve as generals in war, but their decisions can be overridden by a majority vote at the Gerousia. Okay, so if all of the elders think that they are doing something completely idiotic, they can override it.
Yeah.
All right, and each of them can override the other, similar to what you see in Rome later with the consuls.
Checks and balances.
Mhm. The kingship is also,
The kings,
yeah, the kings, so you took the words right out of my mouth. You have, the kings are not inherited status. The kings are elected from within the General Assembly and the Gerousia. Okay, they're not, the kings are not going to be members of the Gerousia because they're meant to be out there fighting at the head of the army too, but
And the idea is that will
Yeah.
keep them more focused on what is the good of the state versus themselves.
Mhm.
If it's not inherited, the idea that they're trying to protect, the lineage for the throne for a son.
So it's elected or done by acclamation. If you have a king die on the battlefield and somebody else is kind of like acclaimed and pushed into the position of leadership after that, then they're generally the next king.
Yeah.
One of the next kings.
Yeah, Leonidas is a.
Yeah,
perfect example.
Leonidas, yeah.
We talked about the
Yep.
Gerousia, the Apella.
Right, and then you have 5 men called ephors who are annually elected basically to act as administrators within the city.
And they also kind of see what has been going on with
Yeah.
the kings to make sure that they're not corrupt.
Yeah.
So,
So the design of the government with these checks and balances, in fact, is said to have come from the leader Lycurgus. Okay, and Lycurgus might have been a real person, or he might not have been. There may have been somebody named Lycurgus who maybe did 1 or 2 of the things that are credited to him, but certainly one person did not do everything that is credited to him. Okay. So supposedly he was granted the laws from the oracle at Delphi. Okay, so the Spartan laws had divine sanction. Spartan laws came from the gods. This is something that we will see as different from Athens, where their laws come from logic and reason and working things out. However, it's going to be the best for the city-state.
should probably explain what the Oracle of Delphi is.
Do you want to?
Okay, so Greek religion at this point in time is polytheistic, so many different gods and goddesses, each, having their own particular kind of area in the world, what they control. This oracle at Delphi is a temple that has been created at this mountain. And all of the Greek city-states will send representatives when they're trying to come up with an important decision, whether it's something just internal to their city-state or something in terms of a large-scale threat. They send people there, and what ends up happening is you have this woman who is supposed to be the voice. A priestess, yeah, a voice of the gods. Who,
Apollo in particular.
You ask the question, and then she gives a cryptic answer. And then the priests who are there decipher what she says, whether it's a positive or a negative response to what you're doing. Now, again, for most of the city-states, especially the Spartans, if they get a poor reading of what the future is, they won't go with the decision that they thought they were going to. Now, the kind of crazy thing with this oracle at Delphi is that this is there's cracks that are in this temple where you have fumes coming up, sulfuric fumes, so basically the question is this priestess really communing with the gods, or is she just, oxygen deprived as you go through there? But
it was seen as a place where you could commune with the gods, probably because somebody stumbled in there and was oxygen deprived to start
Yeah.
with. And so it
Same
went from
thing
there.
with, Pompeii and,
Mhm.
Yeah,
what, I can't remember the exact field there. But they,
Oh, yeah.
yeah, around
I
Vesuvius,
can't
yeah.
think of it. Yeah, but I know what you're saying.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's the Oracle at Delphi, and that is an oracle that was maintained, gods, until the Christians took over, in one form or another, because the Romans respected the Oracle at Delphi too. So.
and they were very wealthy because everybody
Mhm.
contributed.
Money and
Mhm.
everything to it, yeah.
So the Romans came and stole.
Give me the treasure.
The Romans did many things, most of which were stealing other people's stuff. Just a-
Well, we know where Great Britain learned that.
Yes. So the governmental design of Lycurgus is said to have lasted because it combined the three basic forms of government, the democracy, the monarchy, and the aristocracy, to allow them to check each other. You will see repetition of this in elected governance throughout the rest of human history. Okay, Rome tries to do this. They succeed at it for a few hundred years. The United States has succeeded at it for a few hundred years so far. The image that I have up there of Lycurgus, that carving, is from there's a room in the Congressional Building. Why have I lost what the
In
word is
Athens?
for that? No, in the United States,
Oh,
at the Capitol.
Capitol.
I lost the word Capitol. This is great.
you're done.
There is a room at the Capitol where they have images like this of all of the great lawgivers of society, of human civilization. And so you may see a few other ones throughout this lecture with the same design. They're all pulled from that. Not that I went and took the picture or anything. So because they have to maintain control over the helots, they don't worry about foreign policy. They create the Peloponnesian League, okay? This is part of how you get Sparta being given soldiers, as Jay was talking about, okay? And what they did was basically, they conquered these areas. They said, you can do whatever you want internally. Don't start any wars without asking us first, because we would be obliged to come and be involved. But other than that,
Yeah.
that's it.
Do what you will, just don't be a troublemaker.
Mhm.
Don't make us come looking for you.
And this gave them control over most of the Peloponnesus by 500 BC. Yeah. So this is going to be an issue that there's going to be fighting between the Greek city-states about, but first there's going to be fighting with the Persians. So then we're going to hop over to Athens and talk about Athenian society. Okay. It starts as an oligarchy, as we discussed before, but develops reforms over the generations to become a limited democracy. This comes from a few different philosopher leaders, however you want to put it. It was first ruled by a concert of a king and an aristocratic assembly. Okay, the king was then replaced by an elected person in 752 BCE, and they were called an archon. Okay. The term of the archon at that point was limited to a decade. So they went from an inherited kingship to an elected position that lasted for a decade. Okay. And then in 683, they went from a decade to a limitation of 1 year. Okay. In that same year, the duties of the archon were then split between 9 men so that none of them could become too powerful. So in the course of a little over a century, you go from having a king in the traditional sense that we think of kings to an assembly of a small assembly of people who are doing the same kind of functioning as that king had been doing.
And one of the things that, because Athens evolves over time, continuously kind of changes the way that its government functions, and it survives where Sparta does not.
Yeah. Right. So then the laws of Athens are codified by a guy named Draco in 621. And he not only codifies the laws, but also codifies punishment for them. So Will Durant says this about it. Quote, he attached to his laws penalties so drastic that after most of the legislation had been superseded by Solon's, he was remembered solely for his punishments rather than for his laws.
The term draconian comes from him. Is a description of him.
Yeah.
And this picture is a really good illustration of what the citadel of a city-state is going to look like. Okay, what you're seeing here, this in Athens is called the Acropolis. This is where they have the main temple to Athena, where they have some of the other temples. This is the area where if the city walls are overrun, this is where the citizens flee to for the last stand.
So in 594 BCE, we have a guy named Solon elected as the head archon, and they decide that there is going to be a new set of laws. The laws of Draco are too draconian. And also there's a bit of an economic depression and there's some other issues going on. So they decide that they're going to give him more power than normal. Okay. So he expands the citizenship by expanding who gets to vote. Those who vote are citizens, and those who are citizens vote. That goes together. He redesigns the judiciary and the courts. He's the one who comes up with the jury of 501 men. Okay. Everyone who was a voting citizen in Athens was eligible to serve on a jury or to serve as a judge. Okay. And it was always 500. It was always an odd number to make sure that there was no ties. Okay. And so for the most important, the worst crimes, however you want to put that, you would have a jury of 501 who would hear the case, and then they would decide. And you never knew if you were going to be on a jury, just like in the United States. So,
And if you're a citizen, you have to vote.
yes.
It's not that you get the option of deciding whether you're going to vote or not. You are voting.
Voting was compulsory. Yeah. He pushed for greater trade with local police. He made a general cancellation of debt. Okay. One of the things he looked at was that the economic situation was, part of it was, the problem was that so many people were in so much debt that they were selling themselves into slavery. So that was one of the issues with losing citizens too. So he just did a general cancellation of debt.
Because generally, you had only a certain group of people who had enough money to be the lenders
Mhm.
who were lending to everybody else. And then there's no money floating around for the rest of the city to survive.
Sound familiar? Yeah. So he also did this because he was fearful of a revolution by the poor. So, the thing about Solon that differentiates him and differentiates Athens from other Greek city-states and earlier Athens is that he does not attempt to say that there is divine inspiration for any of this. This is all reasoned out. This is a law that is being produced because this is how things are going. This is how we want the society to be, and this is how we're going to get there. Okay. So he does not say that the gods inspired any of it. He just gives it logical thought. He also made all of the laws available to the public. They were written out. People could look at them who could read, and they were there. And so everybody knew what the laws were. Will Durant says this about it. Legally, his work marks the end of government by incalculable and changeable decrees and the beginning of a government by written and permanent law. For the sake of thinking about what else is going on at the time, we're a couple hundred years past Rome being founded, but we haven't yet gotten to the Republic yet. They haven't overthrown their kings. So Rome is still like this little backwater in Italy, right? He steps down in 572, excuse me. And everything goes to hell. He steps down, and the idea being, as we would see in later history too, the office being more important than the man doesn't work. Eventually here, within a generation, excuse me, the Athenians are overtaken by a guy who is a genuine tyrant, okay, named Pisistratus. His story is a wonderful example of something that the Athenians did, which was called an ostracism, okay? The Athenians, if an election could be called to boot the most difficult people out of the city, okay? And that was called an ostracism. So very similar to the modern English word, it's derived from the word for the little pieces of clay that were used in voting. Those are called ostraca.
Ostraca.
They're broken pots, tablets, whatever. You'd write the name of the person that you wanted booted out of the city on it, and then they'd count them.
Yeah.
And then whoever was voted to be removed had to leave for a decade. Okay. So he comes into power, and the next year he gets ostracized. He comes back early. Okay, he comes back in 550. He doesn't wait the full decade. But he says that he has been visited by Athena, who says that she wants him in power of her city, in charge of her city. Okay. Which convinces apparently enough people to let him back in for a year, and then he's expelled again. Okay. And then he comes back again. And then he holds on to the dictatorship this time until he dies, which is a couple years later. He is succeeded by his son, a man named Hippias. Okay. And Hippias was much more of a tyrant in the way that we think of tyrant, tyrannical in that he was holding power militarily. He was holding power by fear instead of respect, that kind of thing. And the Athenians actually, some of the Athenian people actually go to Sparta and request Sparta's help to get rid of this guy, and Sparta does help them. So then we go back to having a democracy. And this democracy is, and then Hippias defects to Persia. Okay, so keep that in the back of your head, because this guy is going to Persia. Right. So after this, we have a guy named Clisthenes come in. And he's the one who sets up what we think of as the Athenian democracy. This is classical Greece as you were taught about in school. Okay, this is the Greece of Plato and Aristotle and Socrates. Okay, he gets his position by overthrowing Hippias' successor, and he is essentially in a popular dictatorship, but he uses that position to initiate a democracy. Okay, this is close to a true democracy, because all men over the age of 21 were able to vote whether or not they were property owners. Okay, obviously it excludes women, or excuse me, they had to be property owners. Obviously excludes women, excludes slaves, all of that. But in terms of what the ancient world had, this is as close as you're going to get outside of tribal cultures. Yeah. Now, the thing we have to remember about everything I just talked about for the last 10 minutes, some of it might not be true. Okay. The information we have on early Athens up to the creation of the position of archon comes from one source. That source is a man named Eusebius. Okay. He would be, if you've heard of him, it was probably as the biographer of Constantine. He's writing around 310 CE. Okay.
So he's writing almost 800 years
Yeah.
later.
He is drawing from one work that we know of, and this is a Greek grammarian and historian by the name of Castor. Castor is writing in around 200 BCE. Excuse me. So what we have here is events in the 500s, events in the 700 to 500s, okay, that are being written down by somebody in the 200s. That information is then being relayed via someone 500 years later in the 300 CE, okay, via Greek to Latin, all right? On top of that, we do not have any of the originals of either. We only have copies. We don't even have full copy. We have little chunks of Castor. We have full copies of Eusebius, but we have little chunks, and that's it. So if somebody messed this up along the line, intentionally or not, let's just assume that it was never intentional. They still could have screwed it up royally. Okay. So it might not be true.
That could be an idolized version.
Yeah, yes, and that's the most likely explanation, even accepting it as true. The earliest piece, the earliest of Eusebius's works we have is a translation from his Greek into Latin from 50 years after he wrote it. So there's dun, 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 dun. Yeah. Ancient world, yeah, fun.
Again, it's those little campfires and the,
Mhm.
the dark landscape that we're just seeing
Mhm.
little glimpses of what's happening at different times.
I should say here, we know that some of this absolutely is true because we have archaeological evidence for it. Okay. But for example, that picture of Pisistratus right there, we aren't actually sure that that's Pisistratus in that sculpture. I have seen that sculpture attributed to 5 or 6 different philosophers. It was just that when I made these slides, which was a long time ago, that was the one that came up as Pisistratus. So I used it, and it wasn't until later that I found out that there's places that attribute that, they say that that's Homer. There's places that say that that is Socrates. There's places that say that that is Plato, and there's other ones too. So we have evidence that backs this stuff up, but not all of it. Or.
Okay. Welcome to my favorite subject. Okay.
I was trying to sound like one of those the newsreels from the 40s. Or yeah.
So you have these Greek city-states that are in the mainland. You have the colonies that are spread throughout the eastern part of the Mediterranean, into the Black Sea, and they're pretty much all independent, disorganized. There's not a singular power that controls all of them in terms of what their foreign policy is, what their internal policy is. However, if you go into, you go deeper into the ancient Near East, you go deeper into what would be modern day Iran, Iraq, Syria, Turkey, you do have a lot of much larger, much better organized, more ancient civilizations that are basically in control of these regions. And one of them is pretty much the superpower of the time. It's the Persian Empire. This is a relative newcomer. It is founded in the mid 600s BCE, and it overruns much of what we would consider the ancient Middle East, okay, including Egypt, Palestine, Israel, Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, Turkey, let's see, Iraq, Iran, parts of Armenia. It goes all the way east, okay, to basically India. Okay, this is one of the largest land empires of all time. Okay, and what is happening in the late 500s is that Persia is still advancing westward. And as it's doing that, it's absorbing those Greek colonies that have been set up, okay, along the coastline of Turkey. And with the Persians, they have an interesting way of ruling it. There is a king of kings, okay, a Persian who is part of the aristocracy, who is the leader of the entire empire. But each province inside his empire also can have other kings who are subservient to him. And as long as you basically maintain order of your region within the Persian Empire and you don't cause problems for the king of kings, he doesn't care what you do. The Greeks that are getting absorbed along this coastline, these are called the Ionian Greeks. Okay, and in some cases, these cities have been there for centuries before the Persians show up, so they already have their own identity. When the Persians come in, a lot of those city-states do not want to be part of that empire. They want to operate as they always had been, independent.
By the time you get to mid-century, they are, how to put this, they're paying lip service taxes to the country of Lydia. And they don't have to deal with the Persians until Lydia is taken by the Persians.
Yeah.
And all of her tattoos. Oh, come on, I thought you guys would get that joke.
All right, well,
The tattooed lady, Groucho Marx.
Lydia, oh Lydia. the
Thank you.
encyclopedia.
I never try that joke with my regular students because I know they won't get it. Okay.
And a lot of these Ionian city-states are incredibly wealthy because of where they sit and the natural resources that they control. And some of them have surpassed like Sparta and Athens and Corinth in terms of wealth, in terms of size, because again, in this area, you have a lot more natural resources you can work with. And so what will end up happening is that, you still have that kind of idea of, the Ionian city-states are looking at the Greek mainland as the mother. And so if there's trouble with the Ionians, they look to the older city-states, the original city-states, for help. They're not asking them to send, they're asking for money. They're asking for mercenaries. They're asking for warships. They don't want Athens and Sparta to come over and dictate their foreign policy. They're basically saying, give us the material we need to fight against the Persians. And for the most part, mainland Greeks, especially when it comes to Athens, they're for that. Sparta is more isolationist. They're looking at it as, we've got enough that we're dealing with in our territory. Who cares what happens to the Ionian Greeks? They went over there to colonize how many centuries ago? They're independent. Let them figure their own problems out. Because if the Spartan army has to leave their homeland, that leaves Sparta vulnerable to a rebellion. So that's one of the things where Sparta is really cautious when it comes to overseas expeditions. They don't want to leave home if they can help it. Now, what starts to end up happening is that, each of these Ionian city-states, again, they operate with their own foreign policy. They have their own, issues with their fellow Greek neighbors and then the native populations that are nearby. It's not unusual for some of these city-states to, again, hire mercenaries in order to fight against fellow Greeks or band together with fellow Greeks to fight against the Lydians or the Persians, whoever is the existential threat at the time. Now, when it comes to 499, you have the leader of this city-state of Miletus, which is one of the really large, wealthy Ionian Greek city-states. Pretty much whatever it does, the other ones will follow because they have a large army of their own and they have a relatively good-sized navy of their own. And so if they say, we're going to rebel against the Persians, we're not going to pay the tribute, we're going to try to break away from them, the other Ionian Greeks will follow. What ends up happening is that the leader of Miletus, Aristogoras, he raises his own city-state's army, and then he gets the other city-states that are near him to do the same thing. And what he ends up doing is he marches to the capital city of the Persian province, this place called Sardis. The way the Persians split their empire up to make it more manageable is they create these things that are called satrapies. They're basically self-governing regions. There's a person that's named a satrap who basically is the governor of that region. He's responsible for making sure that taxes are collected, that crops or whatever goods that this region produces actually get to where they need to go in order to provide tribute for the Persian king.
And he answers directly to the Persian king.
Yes.
There is no go-between.
Yeah, there's no go-between. Each satrapy has its own army in order to protect itself from internal revolts or external threats. What the Persian kings did in order to kind of watch what each of these satraps would do is there's twin capital cities in Iran that are the heartland, Pasargad and Persepolis. But for the major cities in these satrapies, what the Persian court does is that it leaves the highland of Iran and it goes to these different major satrap capitals over the course of a year to ensure that their governors are doing exactly what they're supposed to do. And it's not just the king and his queen and his concubines, it's his bodyguards. It's the regular Persian army that's going to go with him to make sure that there's no rebellions as they go through. Sardis is kind of the furthest northwest of all of these satrapy capitals. And Aristogoras believes that if he can take the Sardis, the capital of this particular satrapy, then people who are not necessarily satisfied with Persian rule might rise up and support these Ionian Greeks. It does not work that way. He gets there with his army, and it does not go, okay, the way that they expected. He gets to Sardis, he surrounds the city. He does end up overrunning the city, but not the citadel. And the satrap, the governor, leaves the city and goes to another province of the Persian Empire to alert the king that this has happened. And it just so happens that the Persian king and his army are in what is modern day Iraq. When they find out that this happens, what that king does is he orders all of the other satrapies, all the other provinces in the Persian Empire, start raising your armies and march towards this area. And we will meet and we'll crush the Greeks. We'll crush the rebels that are there. He doesn't really need to wait for all those reinforcements to come. The army that the Persian king has is big enough on its own. And so he ends up chasing Aristogoras and his army away from Sardis back to Miletus. And then begins this basically what amounts to a 5-year siege of all of these Greek coastal city-states, where the Persians are forcing each city-state to surrender and basically reaffirm that they're going to be loyal. Okay.
And the wonderful irony of all this is that as far as we can tell from the sources, the Persians barely knew that Greece existed.
Yeah, Greece to them, Europe to them was a frontier. It was a backwards area. There's not a lot of large population centers, not like you would see in Egypt or Syria or Turkey or Iraq or Iran or India, where you had these, thousands of year old cultures that had built these huge population centers. The Persians take those over, and they're very cosmopolitan. They have a huge, mixing pot of different ethnic and cultural groups. And to them, the Greeks are just on the doorstep, the next group of people we have to conquer. Now, part of the problem for the Persians is that it's not just the Greek city-states that are along the coast, those Ionian Greeks who are fighting them. The Athenians are supplying warships and soldiers to these rebelling states. And one of the things that ends up happening is how, they're kind of running between the coastline to mainland Greece is they're using slaves as the people who are running the messages from places like Miletus to Athens. They're basically running blockades. They're running they're trying to break through Persian warships to get in the Aegean Sea so that they get to mainland Greece to get more money and war material. One of those ships is intercepted, and one of the slaves that is captured, because they're not going to have, a papyrus scroll on them or a tablet with them. It's tattooed on his head what they need. And when the Persians capture him and they go through and they,
How did they know they were slaves?
Yeah.
That answers that question.
Mm-hmm. They have the message and they know which Greek city-states in mainland Greece are supporting the rebellion. Athens and Corinth. That makes the Persian king mad because he's looking at it as, you are outsiders helping rebels in my territory fight against me. And this has been 5 years that I've been doing this, putting these people down. Not only is it the regular siege and battles that are going on, he also has to leave garrisons, soldiers in each of the cities that rebelled to make sure that they don't rebel again. And what will end up happening is that the Persian king decides, all right, these city-states in Greece want to help, okay, their co-ethnic group, then they're going to get punished for it. And he's going to assemble a massive army and navy in order to try to put down Athens and the other city-states. Now, again, this is not necessarily a very easy thing for, these Persians to put together. Here's the funny part about it. The Persian High King, Darius, is actually a usurper. He's not part of the Persian royal family. He is part of the Persian aristocracy. And there was an ineffective Persian king who took over before him. Darius ends up getting the 12 most powerful Persian aristocratic families to support his overthrow. He basically says that the Persian king who took the throne is not the real family member, that he is an imposter, that the real heir died, and this guy has just taken his position. And Darius is going to lead this rebellion to overthrow him, to reestablish the right lineage on there. He's basically going to put another member of the throne on there. What he does, though, is when he takes over the Persian Empire, he wipes out the original royal family, all of them. And then once he has his position secured, he then wipes out the 12 families that supported him. Okay. And so Darius's lineage is very new. It's not secure. This is a chance for him to basically have justification for why he is ruler of this empire. This war against the Greeks is a way to basically put the stamp on that he is a favorite of the gods, to go through with this. So he starts assembling an army and a navy, and they're going in basically two different directions. The army is going to go obviously overland. It's following the coastline of Turkey and then kind of Thessaly into Greece itself. The naval part of it is basically sailing and hitting different islands on its way to go as close to Athens as possible to land. And in theory, these two military groups are supposed to meet with each other and then march on Athens together. The land group, it takes longer to go through. They do subjugate pretty much all of Greece's northern neighbors, but it takes longer than they expected. So only one part, the naval part of this Persian expedition, actually gets to mainland Greece. And what will end up happening is that the Greek city-states in the mainland, they've come to the understanding that individually they will not survive against the Persian Empire. They cannot stand alone. And so the strong ones start to kind of band together with the idea that, all right, we're not going to leave Greece to fight the Persians. We'll fight them here, but the question is, where are we going to fight them and when? And Athens knows that they're the target. They have a large navy, reasonable sized army. They're relying on the Spartans with their professional soldiers to be the shock troops for this combined Greek army, because everybody is supposed to contribute men and material to stop this Persian invasion. Not every Greek city-state is on board with this. One of the northern ones, Thebes, backstabbers, they have a tendency of doing what will support them the best. There's generally a plan that they know that Athens is going to be one of the first cities that the Persians go after. When they send news to the other city-states assemble their armies and then they march towards Athens, and then everybody combines and they meet the Persians as a combined force. Well, here's where the Spartan superstition rolls in. This Persian naval force has soldiers with it, so it's not just ships, it's actually an army that's there. They land at this place that's called Marathon. It's this little village that's to the northeast of Athens. It's within, a day's march of it. When they get there, they don't immediately push towards Athens because they build a camp to basically protect themselves and the ships that they have. And they're trying to wait for the Persian army that's going overland to meet them. The Athenians find out that the Persians have landed and they send messages to Sparta. And they're like, look, there's a Persian army here. We need you to come here and we can defeat this one. And, and the Spartans are like, okay, well, let's see what the gods have to say about this. And they say, okay, we can do that, but not until the next new moon or full moon. It's got to be 30 days from when it is. The Persians are going to wait 30 days. So the Athenians decide to go on their own with the city-state allies that are closest to them. The Athenians are really opportunistic in how they do this. They put their hoplites on either side of the main Greek army. And then their poor allies get stuck in the center. And what happens is, as this Greek line is advancing, the Persians come out to meet them. And they hit the center of the Greek army. And there's not as many of those allies as there are Athenians. And so the Greek line starts to bend and bow backwards. And the Persians just keep pushing more and more people in there because they're trying to break that line. And then the Athenians on the ends swing in and hit the Persians from behind. They basically sacrifice their allies so that they could win the battle at Marathon. And it is a rout. They end up crushing the Persians that leave that fortified camp to fight them. And then once that part of the army breaks and the survivors run towards the beach to try to get on their ships, the Athenians chase them into the water in order to kill as many of them as they can.
And the Persians that end up in the water, these drown.
Mhm.
Almost anytime. The storm that's mentioned here on the slide that they had tried in 492. Persians, swimming was not something that Persians did. You know, Greeks kind of grew up swimming. That's part of Greek culture. So they couldn't survive. That's part of the issue there. Yeah.
And what ends up happening is this is where the sport, the event, the marathon comes from. Because one of the Athenians is sent back from Marathon to run
26 miles.
26 miles in order to basically tell the Athenians that this army the Persians has been defeated. But here's the catch. Even though that Persian army has been kind of crushed, there's still enough Persians on board the ships that make it into the water that they could go to Athens and attack it before this Athenian army can march back. Now, supposedly, according to the mythology, Philoctetes dies, he runs himself into exhaustion, and then says victory, and then croaks. Because most of your messages are passed by runners. This is humiliating for the Spartans because they're supposed to be the land power, and they don't show up to this fight. And the Athenians who were begging them for help went on their own. And that makes Athens it puts them in a better position with the other Greek city-states because they're looking at like, oh, you actually did show up and you won. Where the Spartans are like, you talked about showing up, but you never did. It's kind of like that idea of I have a girlfriend in Canada. That's the Spartans. They're there. And so this first Peloponnesian War is a victory for the Greeks.
Persian War.
Persian War, sorry. The first, yeah, it's a victory for the Greeks. And while it kind of gives them the idea that, there is going to be another Persian invasion sometime in the near future, we're not entirely sure when it's going to happen, and we need to coordinate. Okay, we actually, if we're going to be part of these alliances, Greece, Athens and Sparta are supposed to support each other. Spartans have to show up. And so the Spartans are going to be a lot more willing in the Second Persian War to send their army to try to slow the Persians down.
And we'll pick that up next week.
Yes.
Questions, comments?
So I left you on the cliffhanger. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.